Hi and welcome to Key Questions with me, Yehuda. Basically, in this series, I'm going to be answering all the questions that I didn't really cover on the TNT podcast. If you've missed that podcast, there is an annotation which is just right across the screen now. And the first question for the first episode of Key Questions is, who were you before you started this spiritual journey? Well, obviously I have to go right back to the beginning. Of course, my life started at a very different point, in a very different state. Basically, as a teenager, I was the kind of guy who'd do anything to make it in the world, including stepping on the toes of other people. I hung around with the wrong people, made a lot of wrong choices, and I sometimes broke the law. I'm not proud of it, but to have made wrong choices isn't a terrible thing. To keep making them when you know better is. And whilst I'm not proud of what I did, I'm proud that I can sit here and explain that I did what I did and I became a better person because of how my experiences shaped me. I always had a sense of right and wrong, but it reached the point where I thought that gaining my own self-reliance and not depending on people was more important, because I live with two family members who are also my carers, and I did then as well, and I didn't want to be constantly depending on them. So this led me to a point where I thought that doing things in order to be independent, i.e. stealing, getting onto pirate radio stations rather than legally pursuing a career in radio, was a better way of gaining my independence than just patiently waiting. Mind you, I've never been a patient person. And I always did have a spiritual side to me. As I said in the podcast, I was always into reggae music, and it spoke a lot about the Old Testament and Zion and Israel, and I was raised in a sort of culturally Methodist home, so I kind of knew a little bit about the Old Testament, as I used to call it. But, you know, to have a sort of spiritual side, according to the people that I was mixing with, was seen as weak, and so I just kind of shut off that part of me, shut up my conscience, and just kept on going, and I kind of followed the herd, which, as you probably know, isn't the smartest thing to do, because you quite often end up repeating other people's mistakes. And then one day I got caught. One day the police came to my house. My family was very upset, in bits. I still remember my nan was in tears. I've never seen her like that before. It was just awful. Absolutely awful, because they sent a van full of people around to get me. And I still remember my little cousin. I remember him coming around and saying things like, "Don't let them take you away, don't let them take you away. If you say you're sorry, they'll let you go." And, excuse me a moment. Okay, I've composed myself a bit now. So yeah, we're at the point where I got caught. Then after that, I was only cautioned, by the way, and it was just for appearing on a pirate radio station. So, I mean, but it could have been a lot worse given the people that I knew and the type of stuff that they did. In terms of what happened after that, I got into college and I started to pursue my spirituality a bit more. And it was at that point that I met somebody who was involved in the evangelical movement. And as you'll hear in my podcast, it didn't really go too well from there. Well, it did in the beginning, but then it didn't go too well later on. eventually when I got into uni, and I'll cover that in my second video in more detail entitled Why Judaism. So stick around for that. Make sure you check out the podcast and the annotation across the screen, and I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. This has been Yehuda on the first episode of the Key Questions series.